Hi, I'm Assemblymember Susan Talamantes Eggman, Chair of the California Legislative LGBT Caucus. The 2016 Pride Ceremony, Honoring the Past, Securing the Future, celebrates the caucus formation and history. Formed in 2002, the California Legislative LGBT Caucus has a history of furthering equality and justice for all LGBT Californians and hopefully the nation. Our caucus was the first of its kind in the country, and I'm pleased to introduce the following video, Pride with Purpose.
There really was nothing on the books that protected LGBT people in any way in California. Not one thing. There was no caucus when it was just me. It was interesting, there was a cartoonist that liked to do a 4-panel cartoon about the legislature in those days. And she did one that was called The Gay and Lesbian Caucus Goes to Lunch. And it showed like an empty table, an empty table, an empty table. And the 4th panel was Kuehl, Party of One. When Migden was elected, we still didn't think we needed a caucus. There were like 2 of us. But when Jackie and Chris were elected, then there were 4 of us. Perhaps we should ask the Speaker to give us a little funding, like the other caucuses got, so that we could be an official caucus, we could call ourselves a caucus, and we would get recognition as such.
Kevin Murray and Antonio Villaraigosa, in particular, helped form the first LGBT caucus because they filled out the group with honorary members. In the next 2 decades, the growth that we've seen in terms of representation has been huge.
I remember being a staff member to City Council Member Chris Kehoe when Sheila Kuehl was elected to the Assembly. And then to see her rise and become the Speaker Pro Tem was another really significant thing for the LGBT community.
One of the things that struck me then was that Sheila Kuehl, Carol Migden, Jackie Goldberg, and I, the 4 open lesbians, would soon be joined by 2 new members, most likely after the coming election in 2002. That was Mark Leno of San Francisco and John Laird from Santa Cruz.
Assemblyman Mark Leno, representing the 13th Assembly District in San Francisco. I was the first openly gay man, along with John Laird, elected to the legislature, and that was in November of 2002. 6 years later, the first openly gay man elected to the state Senate.
When I did get elected in 2002, and Mark Leno and I were the first 2 openly gay men elected to the legislature, it was, I think, one of the first times that it actually was a little bit of a positive to be openly gay, because history was going to be made.
One thing the 4 women learned when Mark and John came in and we suddenly had men in the caucus was how important it was to diversify. I know that sounds funny, but we were very comfortable with each other, and unlike what everyone thinks, we were very comfortable with men as well, but it really adds a richness.
It was, I believe, the first of its kind in the nation. It's certainly the largest of its kind in the nation. No other legislature has what we have here in California.
Me just standing there raising my right hand and taking the oath was the significant victory. I was just always amazed it took so long for men that were open to get into the California legislature, and I think part of it was the HIV epidemic.
Had they not been the types of legislators they were, it wouldn't have created the possibility for me to be elected as the first LGBT person of color elected to the state legislature, much less the first LGBT person elected to be Speaker of any state legislature across the country.
I never thought about running for office. It was Chris that was a mentor and told me that I had a responsibility. I feel like I stand on the shoulders of some incredible pioneers who helped us break into politics.
We began to think of how to highlight LGBT civil rights issues. We started to work on the annual Pride celebration.
Marriage equality kind of took a front seat in a lot of what we were talking about. There were people in the legislature when I was elected who had not been allowed to marry early on because they wanted to marry a person of color and they were white. And so we had very interesting interracial stories that led these folks to understand kind of what we were talking about.
Members of this caucus wrote the first legislation anywhere in the country to be passed, unfortunately not signed into law, that allowed for true total marriage equality. It was the California legislature that acted first.
At the same time, we were very concerned about employment issues, about housing issues, about all the things that you could get with domestic partner that were important, not just about marital rights, but about property rights.
I was standing in the back of the assembly chambers in 2008 when the Supreme Court in California ruled on marriage equality. I was so moved, I did what I never thought we would do. I took out my cell phone and I called my spouse at work and I proposed. After a while he says, "You're doing this over the phone." I had to go and talk to him personally, and of course he said yes.
Our issues of LGBT civil rights have certainly come a long ways. We have passed over 100 bills relative to our civil rights that have become law in that same time period.
But in too many places, you could get married on Saturday and then be fired on Monday because of your sexual orientation. And that's why it's important that the rest of the country catch up with California to have true, meaningful, inclusive employment non-discrimination legislation as well.
We talk about the theme, love wins. We've talked about that again and again as we achieved marriage equality, that in the end, love wins. We need to see that that's about embracing all communities.
The violence that we saw in Orlando and that we see on the streets of this country every day.
There's been a great deal of interest in the gay community about gun control measures. Every community that suffers from gun violence is a new community to come in and say, I want to join the fray.
Our collective and individual accomplishments through these 14 years, of which I've been so privileged to be a part of every one of them.
The brilliance of some of these elected officials, you see how they were able to be effective in the legislature, how they were able to turn the tide of how people viewed the LGBT community. I have the good fortune to follow in the footsteps of people who made the path a little easier for us.
I think the role of the LGBT caucus is very important going forward because I think other legislators look to the caucus to really talk about what emerging issues are.
So I think that our community needs to continue to be engaged in health reform, in anti-discrimination work, but not just about us. And I, of course, would always want to emphasize our work with the transgender community.
And although there are certainly big issues to confront, we will get there in the future, just as we have knocked down barrier after barrier over the last 20 years.
Always there are new issues and new things that we need to address, and we've got a full plate of legislation before us this year as well. So there'll be work to do for this caucus for many years to come.
I think it really speaks to how we're viewed by our colleagues now, and the fact that our sexual orientation doesn't have to be an impediment to how our colleagues evaluate us and look to us as leaders as they would look to anybody else.